Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat. We're grateful to have the opportunity to live on this territory. The format for this event is a hosted conversation with audience questions. You can ask questions by entering them into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. This webinar is being closed captioned by AI Media, and if you need closed captioning, you can turn it on in your Zoom app. Now, I'd like to introduce the host for this event, Milosha Wadamaniak, Senior International Programmer for Hot Docs, who will introduce our fantastic lineup of guests. Take it away, Milosha.
Thanks, Shane. Good afternoon, good evening, good morning, everyone. I certainly hope that here at Hot Docs 2020, we are reaching you safely and happily today to talk about just a lighthearted topic of a new algorithmic world order, COVID-19 surveillance and the end of truth. I'm so pleased to not only be part of a festival that can present groundbreaking and really significantly innovative films like Tonje Hessen Schei's iHUMAN, but also to be able to have an informed discussion with you today, not only with our filmmaker Tonje, but with also two of the film's participants, Hao Li and Lee Fang. So I welcome all of you. Tonje, I'm going to start and dive right in with you. Obviously, people are familiar with your previous films, Drone and Play Again. You are no stranger to investigating how AI is changing how we live and how the information we receive is changing the way we live. I'm wondering if you can give us just a little bit of a snapshot of where you were before you started with this specific film, in your feelings of how much, I'm going to say, trust you had in information, the way you received it, and if that perspective has shifted since the film is finished.
You did. Hi, can you hear me now? We're having some technically difficult times right now. Sorry about that. Well, I got the idea for iHUMAN in 2014 when I was working on Drone. And one of the things that was really concerning for me was to see how the weapons were becoming more and more autonomous. And when I started looking into that, I had what I call, a holy shit moment when I realized how already artificial intelligence was everywhere. And since then, we have been surfing on, a huge AI tsunami. And one of the things that has been really, really concerning to me is to see the extreme rapid pace that this technology is developing. And also just realizing that AI is already everywhere. We are facing maybe the most far-reaching, powerful technology of our times. It is in our phones, it is online, it's in structures in society, and we still have not had a proper debate about what are the ethical challenges that we need to solve with this technology before we start using it. When I started this, I was coming out of working on Drone and working up against the CIA and the US Air Force. And I really thought that it would be very different with iHUMAN, that I would be able to go on the inside of these big tech corporations that are governing our world and kind of see what is going on. How are they developing AI? What are the questions that they are raising at this really, really important time in history? But to see the real information control they have and the extreme power that the tech giants have today has been extremely provoking and also very concerning to me.
Thank you, Tonje. I'm going to introduce now Lee Fang. Of course, you're familiar with his work for The Intercept, his investigative reporting, also from The Nation and ThinkSmart. Lee, you're constantly analyzing public policy and how it intersects with private industry. Tell me, given this new parameter of this pandemic upon us, what has surprised you? Given what is the most tangible, perhaps I could say, advice you could give us about where we can be receiving and feeling confident about the information we're getting?
Well, that's a good question. I think we're all struggling with that problem. We're all cooped up at home, and we're being inundated with information about the constantly changing world, especially with COVID. With respect to data collection and privacy, we have kind of a new world. I mean, just a few months ago, Congress was setting up to enact broad new data collection privacy reforms. There were states across the country that were developing their own forms of GDPR, the data privacy rights that are enjoyed in the European Union. And with COVID, we've backtracked. Congress is no longer enacting privacy legislation. Many states have taken the COVID pandemic as a reason to abdicate their jobs, basically. A lot of state capitals only meet in the spring, and they've canceled their legislative session. So we're seeing no new privacy laws. In fact, it's the opposite. We're seeing the normalization of mass data collection. One kind of interesting anecdote I was talking to a colleague about recently is that even the New York Times, they had a series of stories last year showing how these third-party brokers, these advertising data brokers, were collecting location data from ordinary apps on cell phones and abusing that data, selling it to murky companies, using it in many different ways that are incredibly inappropriate, that are not anonymized, that allow for incredible levels of mass surveillance through personal phones. So the New York Times does these stories last year, but now with the COVID pandemic, the New York Times is using that same type of data collection to do stories about the pandemic and show that individuals are leaving their homes, they're traveling from New York to Florida. That's important journalism on one level, but on another level, given our kind of heightened fears around the spread of this virus, all kinds of new forms of data collection and mass surveillance are being normalized, whether that's in the news, whether that's the government contracting with big tech and defense contractors, using the rubric of public safety and public health to track our movements, to track whether we're violating the quarantine, to track our interactions with other human beings. Now, this is allegedly only to protect us from the spread of the virus, but the civil liberty and privacy implications are manifest. It's possible that some of the technology that's being used that was originally sold as tracking individuals for disease prevention is now being used for tracking protesters. There's some suggestion of that, although it's not confirmed. We live in a very different world than we had just 6 months ago. And I don't want to go on too far, but it's incredible how much has changed just in the last few months.
Absolutely. And Hao Li, let's go right in there with the technology straight away. You are an absolute deepfake pioneer, being a CEO of Pinscreen. I'm wondering, I'm not villainizing, but what have you seen during the COVID, specifically this COVID period, that is alarming to you as someone who is generating these images?
So first of all, since the past few years, there have been like huge advancements in the field of generating very believable medium. Right? We've heard about deepfakes. We have heard about GANs that can generate humans that don't even exist, but people can't really tell the difference if they're real or not. I think specifically on the disinformation side, one thing that we can observe is that there hasn't been so much that is used, or not to my knowledge, where deepfakes specifically for face replacement have been used. Mm-hmm. There are instances, for example, where journalists are, being anonymous and, creating fake profiles of themselves using, algorithms like GANs to generate a fake profile of themselves and writing serious stories, right? So those kind of things have emerged. On the other hand, there are also like fun things, probably, some of the viral videos, including Baby Trump that was like promoted by Jimmy Kimmel. So those kind of things, you can typically see like two sides of things where people are creating satires or, viral videos. But on the other hand, I think on the use of advanced technologies to create fake information that hasn't been used that much, I think simply because you don't really need those to spread disinformation.
I think it's really interesting, Lee Fang, that you bring up the fact that Congress and oversight seems to be abdicating their role during this time, that they were meant this spring to be working and they are physically unable to meet to do that. But what I'm wondering alarms you the most during this specific time, what should we as a public, if public is even a word we can use any longer, what we as private citizens should we be thinking about, should we be doing, should we be requesting to prompt government to be more proactive in privacy?
Well, I think the very first thing we can do as members of the public or members of the media is to ask bigger questions of our public officials, to say, if there is an emergency exemption from privacy laws for the pandemic or for whatever reason, those exemptions should have a sunset. They should expire at some date. They shouldn't be unlimited. We can look back in our recent history and see so many emergency laws around terrorism, around other national emergencies, never actually end. The emergencies continue and continue, and they become formalized in our fabric. And further, I think we just need to take a cool, rational look at the problems ahead of us. It's easy to stare at your phone and look at all these negative headlines and get more panicked and filled with anxiety. And that kind of fear leads to extreme legislating, extreme policy making. We need to take a step back and realize that any of these actions, any of this mass surveillance, mass data collection can have unforeseen consequences. It can have implications that go well beyond anything related to the COVID-19 pandemic. And look, I think we're seeing a larger recognition that all of our devices, our digital world, is being used to track us. The data that's being collected is being fed into AI testing that develops stronger and stronger technology for predicting our emotions, predicting our feelings, predicting, using facial recognition, movement recognition, powerful technology that, if in the wrong hands, can be easily abused, whether by the military or simply by powerful political interests that want to use mass media, use very personalized messages, using AI, using the kind of data that they collect us to manipulate us, to tug at our heartstrings, to win elections and to hide the truth. And we're also in an election year, and it's looking a lot like the same type of technology we've already discussed, whether that's phone tracking, whether that's facial recognition, whether that's deepfakes. It's likely to play a big role in the presidential election.
Certainly. Tonje, knowing that you already had a vast expanse of information about the types of surveillance systems that perhaps the general public is not really aware of, has, during the process of making this film and in the wake of this film, have you been surprised by any new such structures?
Well, I think during the production of iHUMAN, the most example that we saw was when we went to China, and we saw how the architecture for surveillance was so widely spread, and the way that it was used was, not surprising, because we knew a lot about it when we went there, but to actually feel it and to see all the cameras that were spread everywhere, and how everybody is tracked continuously, and then coming back, home to Norway and seeing how things are also in the States and then the rest of Europe, we're also moving towards that direction. And with AI, with the collection of our data, with the massive surveillance through our phones, it's important to realize that we are completely dependent on more and more intelligent machines that hear what we say and see what we do. And we're part of this, matrix to some extent that I think is really almost impossible to get out of. So how do we, how do we develop a new way of critical thinking about what's going on? How do we find information about the situation that we're in? I think is really, really crucial right now. And we need to ask questions. We need to develop a new way of critical thinking and demand that, you know, when the big tech call us users, how are we also being used? How are we being manipulated? How is this affecting our private lives, but also our societies and our very democracies? And that I think is really, really crucial. And as we're seeing, you know, with COVID, when COVID sort of paused the world right now, everybody thought, you know, well, technology is just going to solve all of this. Everybody's going to, you know, download all these apps, and we're going to know where everybody is to, you know, track who has COVID, who has not COVID. And all of this, for me, you know, it was kind of like all this like sci-fi realities that we had touched on in iHUMAN. All of a sudden, they became our reality. And unfortunately, this pandemic is not going to be solved with, you know, just apps. And what we know so little about this pandemic, but what we do know is that social distancing is pretty much the only thing that works. I mean, unfortunately, we're just humans. And we do get sick, and viruses and pandemics is going to be part of, you know, our lives. But how do we stay as safe as possible, but also create the world that we want to come back to after this virus has passed? I think is really, really crucial right now.
I think you've touched on two very specific points that I'd love to get Hao Li and Li Fang's input in. And it actually dovetails with a question that's been submitted to us. And that's specifically why are models still so inaccurate to a very high degree of tracking and tracing the COVID virus? And is this because politics are getting in the way? When are we going to get to the situation described in the film where AI is actually helping? I think that, I mean, that's a very specific question with a very complex set of answers, but I'm wondering how Li, someone who is working in the field with this technology, what do you say to that?
Yeah. So first of all, so we're talking about, you know, prediction models about the spreads and, you know, what we are going to expect in a week, in 2 weeks, in a month, in 2 months. So first of all, these kind of modelings that we see online are based on very, I would rather say basic models, right? It's not, I mean, it's not extremely complex. And one reason why they're doing this is because the entire problem is so complex. So there are so many factors that are influencing how things are being developed. So you can see that specifically in the United States right now. You know, when you watch the headlines, you can see things are going every direction, and it's really, really difficult to predict, you know, what type of policies are being in place. There's so many different states, so the amount of data simply isn't available. And related to all these modeling methods, I mean, they're based on statistical models. But if we were to use something more sophisticated, like, you know, data-driven methods based on, you know, state-of-the-art AI, there simply isn't enough data for us to actually model these things or predict what type of outcomes, you know, accurately, right? But potentially, you know, people are trying all kinds of ways to use data to predict what can happen, use complex you know, computations to simulate what could potentially happen. But the fact is simply that it's just a very complex process. And the only reason why we're doing certain predictions is to have, you know, the ability to do logistical plannings. For example, where do we need ventilators? Where do we need this and that? And to allocate these things better. But, you know, as far as I know, the predictions can only be roughly estimated for what's going to happen in a week.
Fair enough. And Li Fang, I think we also have to acknowledge the fact that the technology that's being developed, it very much, Tonje makes it very clear in the film that it is the private interest that owns the technology that is deciding what that technology is to be used for. So when we have a public health crisis, we as public citizens are hopeful that mechanisms like AI are being benevolently used immediately by all public offices to better the public situation, but that is not in practicality what's happening. What do you know specifically about AI and its ability or inability to track, trace? And we've also had another question submitted. What is AI's role currently in developing the vaccine? If you want to comment on that.
I can't comment on developing the vaccine. I think there are probably many useful applications. Just from reading the news, I understand that several startups, Moderna and others, have brand new RNA sequencing that uses advanced AI and technology that looks very promising for potentially developing a vaccine or certain antiviral drugs. And it's important to acknowledge. But in terms of the mass surveillance, the mass data collection, the mass location tracking, there's a big question mark on how that data is going to be used, how it's going to be stored. One of the first Silicon Valley technology companies to receive a major contract from the federal government to engage in this kind of disease surveillance is Palantir. That's a company that was developed with CIA military support, that has worked with the military, has very controversial contracts with ICE to track down and arrest and deport undocumented immigrants in this country. So this is a company with a very controversial background. And it's not clear how they are storing that data. Who has the rights to the data they collect when they're contracted to engage in disease surveillance? Is that data being used for other purposes, for their other contracts? These questions haven't been answered yet. We don't have a very firm federal guideline for how this data is collected and used, especially as the federal government leans heavily on private contractors to engage in this work. So, there are promising signals from Capitol Hill. There's a bipartisan coalition of lawmakers, indeed even many Republicans, who are becoming more and more critical of the use of this technology, critical of the power of Silicon Valley, of Google and other companies in influencing the policymaking process. There's demands from lawmakers like Senator Josh Hawley, an up-and-coming Republican senator, to give the FTC, this kind of sleepy agency that is in charge with enforcing consumer and privacy rights, that has, done very little in the past. But there's a push to give this federal agency more power to prosecute abuse of data collection. So, a lot of this is doom and gloom, but I think there is a movement to at least empower bureaucrats and regulators to try to take back some of these data privacy rights and give some clarity on how it's used. But right now, it's a very murky world, how this data is collected, how it's being used, and who's doing it.
Maybe I can. Oh, go ahead.
Sorry, Hao Li. I just wanted to remind everyone that we're about to open up to question and answer from our participants. So please keep your questions coming in. We're receiving them as we go, and I'm feeding them in an opportunity to just discuss right before we do that kickoff, this notion of regulation. I think everyone feels that with such a runaway technology that is so powerful, regulation is really the only thing that stands between a private citizen and this real monolith of technology. But let's just be very practical about what regulation should look like. And I'm wondering if I can ask each of you, beginning with Tonje, to tell us, what do you think the state of regulation can possibly be? Is it something that government can keep up the pace of science with, and whose responsibility truly is it? Tonje, let's begin with you.
Yeah, I mean, the issue of regulation is huge and it's very complicated. Before I go into that, I just want to say that I'm absolutely not against AI. Like any technology, AI is a tool that can be used for great things, and it can also be used as a weapon. And right now, we're at this point in history where it is up to us to decide how are we going to use this technology and how should we not use this technology. And in order to do so, we do need international regulations. Here in Europe, EU has sort of taken on a pioneering role. They're doing great work, but it is the beginning, and there's a long way to go. And from this production, just meeting people in the industry in the US, they were terrified for regulations because that meant that they would then fall behind China. But you know, we have to sort of see the overall important goal as for our humanity, because AI can't be just kept to one nation. It is a global phenomenon, and it can be developed in a small lab or by huge governments or private corporations. And we need regulations that span the huge, wide, different needs for this technology. And I believe, I mean, we've been able to do it with nuclear weapons, chemical warfare. And just because it's difficult and complicated doesn't mean that we should just like, you know, let go of the steering wheel. I mean, we have to take control of how this technology is developed and implemented in our lives. And
So
in the
Hao Li, I want you to get right in there, because you are someone who's daily faced with this issue of the ethics of AI. When you sit down and write your code and you're marrying computer graphics with deep learning, what regulations, if any, do you face in your private sector? Give us a window into those decisions.
Right. I can probably speak for both, like the private sector and also the research community in academia. I was a professor until recently. You know, we, in terms of, you know, ethical challenges that you have here is that, first of all, you know, we're building technologies that allows us to create humans that look like real ones, that are, you can't even distinguish. And one of the issues here is that, and everyone knows, is that when misused, you can harm someone. You can take someone's privacy. So some of the main challenges that we've identified is about both privacy and disinformation, right? And the issues that we face is, you know, first of all, who does the data belong to? If we're trying to provide a service and build a virtual assistant based on someone that really exists, is the person having a contract with us and transferring all his data to us? We want to have the ability to let that person manage this, right? But of course, it's not always the case, because what if we build a product that allows other people to generate another digital human or content? Then if are they then responsible for that or not, right? So those kind of questions we face every day. If we build technologies, is it the right thing to even publish that so that everyone knows that these kind of technologies exist? Or shouldn't we even talk about it because it could pose a potential danger by just showing that, you know, you can create, you can manipulate these videos. You already, you know, have the potential danger that people may say, well, now we can implement that as well, especially when you publish, you know, certain technologies, then theoretically anyone can actually build these things as well.
I think we can have a very specific example of that in a moment. And I just want to remind everyone to go ahead and type your great questions, keep them coming through the Q&A function here in the app. But you know, one of the featured people, Tonje, in the film is Ilya Sutskever from OpenAI. And here's a prime example of what we're just talking about right now, Hao Li, of people publishing and having the code and the mechanism free and able to be used by everyone. It's open source. And I think a lot of people had a lot of good feelings around institutions, benevolence around these types of institutions to make that code and those machines, those models available to fact check, to make certain of what the reliability of information. But just as recently as February of last year, or I should say this year, when we're looking at the code that's being used for predictive text. And just to be general about it, I don't mean predictive text in like when you're texting and you're going to make a typo, but they have models, GPT-2, as of, I think it was November of last year, the ability of computers to generate, based on a very tiny 3-4 sentences of information, massive amounts of text that simply expound on those and insert ideas, and it's completely synthetic. Right? And so OpenAI would not put that code on its website because they felt that it was too controversial, that it was too dangerous and could fall into the wrong hands. They've now since reversed that, and GPT-3, the third version, has just, I think last week actually, hit the open market. But what do you make of something like that? I'll ask both Hao Li for that and Li Fang also.
Right. I think so. This is an interesting approach, and we're actually taking a very similar approach with Pinscreen as well, which is we also publish in academic communities about latest capabilities of what things are possible, and we have been debating whether this is a good thing or not. And as I hinted before, there are pros and cons. One reason why it's actually important to put the technology out there and to show that things are possible, but to limit the amount of code or models to be accessible to people is the following. First of all, if you bring certain technologies out there, you actually create awareness that something is possible. And if you ever wanted to protect yourself against these kind of technologies, well, this is the only way. Because you need to know, for example, if you have a chatbot that can pretend to be a human, if you ever wanted to have a way to detect that, well, now you know how your defense mechanisms on how to distinguish between real or fake. If you see imagine if you're using these kind of technologies as a tweet bot, you have the ability to distinguish, well, based on these specific patterns, there's a high probability that this is fake. If we are creating, if certain companies are creating deep fakes, if you don't know how they are being generated, there's no way to understand how to properly detect them, right? Even though, at some point, I believe that, you can't really tell the difference anymore. And I think we're actually very close to that, if not already. And so that's, one of the reasons. However, we did have, organized quite a few panels within the research community among like top AI computer vision researchers, how we deal with code, right? And one in the beginning, our consensus was, well, you should put everything out there. But I think not even a year later, we had another, panel, and I think the consensus was then to say, well, we really shouldn't put all the code out there. Maybe some things for testing, but we have to be able to limit the amount of models so that it cannot be facilitated to use to cause harm.
Right. Li Fang, let's ask you then that same question. People, and we've had a really great question come from the audience, from Jay, asking about what AI there is available for journalists and for individuals to fight disinformation. Do you, as part of the Fourth Estate, look at something like open AI and their ability to put code out there for open source use as something that you feel confident is enough of a safeguard, or what kind of safeguards would you actually like to see?
It's an interesting question. I think from a public policy point of view, as government embraces AI for crime fighting, predictive policing technology, or just city planning technology, there's the danger that these algorithms entrench unfairness or segregation or discrimination that's already pre-existing in society, and then give it kind of a technical airbrush to seem neutral. And so making some of these algorithms, the process for using this AI transparent on some technical level, I think is important for understanding how they're used for public policy purposes. But I think for the average person, we need just more transparency in general on how our data is being collected, and how, when we're consuming political messages, media messages, if our data is being collected and our messages are being personalized, and just broadly, we need to know. We need to know if our smart fridge, our smart TV is listening to us, if we're using an app or a computer program, if our data is being sucked out and being monetized in some way. We need constant, transparent consent and knowledge of how our data is being used. And on an even more structural level, if data is being abused, we need enforcement, whether that's, in California, the new privacy data law enshrines the Attorney General with enforcement capabilities. Nationally, we have that agency I just talked about, the FTC, but that's not enough. If the average consumer is being abused, if their data is being misused, we probably need a private right to action. You know, we need the ability to form a class and file a class action lawsuit and litigate this in the courts, because an individual, regular mom and pop person using their Facebook app, they don't have the legal resources to take on a big tech company, right? And they can't just pick up the phone and call the attorney general and get them on their side. We need better legal tools and legal rights for individual consumers.
Okay, so Tonje, let me ask you then, as someone who has looked at this problem from both sides, because you've had direct contact and ask for access to information to these big tech giants. Robert Ellis, one of our participants, is asking, what is the role of AI itself in tackling the problems caused by the improper use of AI? So given the fact that you have that experience of seeing both sides of that corporate divide, what are your feelings about that, Tonje? Do you feel anxious, or do you feel optimistic?
Well, in some ways, in the science sector, we're going to go into this sort of war of machines where AI is tracking down other AI that's giving misinformation or deepfakes or whatnot. So it's, I think it's going to be really messy, and you know, just taking in like the kind of crazy intense times that we are living in. I think it's really important now we all just sort of take some deep breaths and really try to think about very critically, you know, what kind of information, where do we get our information from? What kind of AI research do we want to support, and you know, what kind of rules and regulations do we want to ensure that come into place? And for me, like, this comes, you know, from a personal point of view, like, what kind of data do you share? How often are you able to actually leave your phone and get offline? And locally, you know, how can you talk to your authorities to try to make pressure for them also to realize, like, how can they use this technology in the best possible way? And then internationally too, we have to put more pressure on EU and the United Nations possibly to really make sure that we get these regulations in place. But because this is a global problem, we're not going to be able to solve it on just one level. It's really complicated. And because I don't trust the war against the good AI and the bad AI to solve itself. So it is up to us to take control of this technology now.
So let me put Hao Li on the spot then. Since you're more conversant in the actual software that we interface with on a daily basis, can you give us a practical tip on what we should, as consumers, and also the products, the data that they want to mine, what should we be most aware of when we're turning our phones on or firing up, whether it's a Mac or Microsoft? What should we be worried about? What should we do?
I think probably the easiest way to think about that is, once you connect yourself to the internet, once you're connected to your device, basically you can just assume that you're giving away your data. There might be someone behind looking at it, or could be looking at certain information. It doesn't have to be real time, could be looking at certain information at a later point in time. And the data not only is used to be stored somewhere, but the data for many use cases are certainly used to even influence your future behavior, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, Lee Fang already pointed out, they're used to predict our behaviors, they used to predict our emotions, etc. But it's really to, these are, social media, any social media is used to make money, right? And, you know, if they understand consumer behavior, if they understand any individual's personalized behavior, that's huge, right? And that's huge in a bad sense. So they have the ability to manipulate how we're going about buying things, how we're going about certain political thoughts. So there's a lot of things that can happen. The other thing, I think, is not only our devices or how we're connected to the internet or what kind of social media platforms we're using. It's also just, surveillance technologies that are in the public, right? once you go out there, and especially now with the corona pandemic, I think one thing that I'm kind of worried about is that there is a intensified use of even existing technologies to repurpose them, to reinforce them for surveillance, right? How do we see? How do we use face detection, body recognition? How do we use drones, even thermal imaging? Those kind of sensing or location trackings. All the data that is being captured could potentially be used to do things that we're unaware of, right? So many of these deep learning based algorithms, once they have sufficient data, they can outperform real humans, meaning that potentially the algorithm can understand us better than ourselves.
I think that is such a significant issue, and I think you're tapping into what we're going to wrap our discussion up on, and that's relating all of this back, Tonje, Lee, and Hao Li, to the fact that we are in a time that was unimaginable as of 6 months ago, and COVID really has changed the way we consume media, where we physically consume it, and how it affects our outlook. We are dealing, I think, with a very understated time of deep anxiety around our physical health, our public health, our social health, and now our computer health. We're facing regulations about how we're opening society up. Lee Fang, you're someone who, this is what you do all the time, thinking about how public and private interest is impacting you. We're all about to face an age, the second wave, actually the second evolution of restrictions on our civil liberties. We're going to be going back into stores, back into schools, back into public locations, and those deep surveillance systems, Hao Li, that you said, are going to be very, very different and very intensified. What protections do you think you're personally going to take? Someone who's in the know, who has you consume it, you're part of it. What are you going to be doing differently in the months coming forward with your data?
That's a good question. I don't know yet. And I think I'm like it. Even though I'm a member of the media that I report on, violations of government trust, of corporate malevolence. I'm still just a normal person, just like anyone else. Trying to understand how I can protect myself online. That I use encryption when I communicate with my colleagues and with my friends. I'm always vigilant, but at the same time, I'm perhaps just as exposed as anyone else. We don't have great data protection rights here in the U.S. California, where I'm based, has the new law I referenced that just came online this year. But there's not much recourse if your data is used, if you are surveilled, if you are digitally profiled, and that information is fed back into a law enforcement system. There's not much you can do without becoming kind of a hermit and completely offline. So that's not a great note, I suppose, to end on. But we don't have many rights. We need not just to kind of bifurcate society. I think if you're an extremely technically savvy person, you can kind of use advanced operating systems and devices that are walled off from mass surveillance and mass data collection. But the average person can't do that. I'm on Twitter and other social media to promote my stories, but I do realize that by just being on those platforms and interacting, I'm feeding my own information up into a cloud. So there's not a lot to say. I think we do just need better fundamental individual rights, and that has to come from big reforms down the road.
So let me let one of our participants put this final question to you then, Tonje. Jürgen Schmidhuber in the film said he doesn't think in a very humanistic way. He doesn't think in a human-centered way. But you are a filmmaker, you are a creative person. You do think in terms of stories in a human way. What role do you feel you have as an artist, and what role does personal expression and that what makes us unique, our data that makes us unique, have moving forward in these next ages?
That's a beautiful question. Well, I
Thank
think
Lori Williams for your beautiful question.
well, thank you. Well, I think it's just so important to realize that, you know, we are together. I mean, I love people, and I think that stories bring us together. And my role as a filmmaker and a storyteller is to bring complex issues to a wide audience, because I feel that information and people being aware of what is going on is the best antidote towards the dystopian, like, you know, future that maybe is coming our way. And then also, you know, I have been showing the film now to thousands and thousands of Norwegian teenagers. And it's been so, you know, it's given me just so much hope to see their engagement, their questions, you know, what are they, you know, they have like a different drive, and they're more part of the digital generation maybe than, you know, I am personally. And there is this hope that, you know, the best way to really control the future is to create it. And I truly believe that a new digital future is possible, where we all can have a voice. And then I think it's really crucial to look at, you know, the huge power that the big tech companies have today, where Google and Facebook use more money on AI, have more power than entire nations. How much power should these companies have? We really need to also build alternatives, so to give them more competition. You know, what other things can we use this technology to that you know, comes to our common good? So even though, you know, we are stuck in a matrix, I really believe that it's possible to change the routes of the matrix and steer it in the right way.
I think that that's as close to a good feel-good note that we can end on. Not that it's our job to make us feel any which way. That's the beauty of iHUMAN, is that you've started this very significant conversation in people's minds. You're asking the questions that some people already are consumed with, and some people have no idea really are dominating our lives in this way. So I thank you so much, Lee Fang, for your work in helping guide those conversations and keeping those conversations open. And to you, Hao Li, for being so open about the ethical issues in your industry. I didn't want to say that you made the baby Trump. You've made other things that have delighted us and worry us. And I thank you so much for sharing your process. And to you, Tonje, for sharing iHUMAN with our Hot Docs audiences in this world that we didn't know was coming, but we are navigating each day in a new way. And Hot Docs thanks you very sincerely. Thank you to all our participants for your wonderful questions as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you again to our guests today for this fascinating discussion, a subject that we're all going to be hearing much more about in the future. Join us for our next Big Ideas conversation on Tuesday, June 2nd at 7 p.m. as we discuss the world of art fraud and con artists as seen in the film Made You Look, a true story about fake art. Thanks again for joining us, and goodbye for now.